Good morning. This is Bill Bushka. Back in 1998, I wrote a book called Our Fundamental Rights, which discussed, basic rights in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, self-defense, from freedom to servitude, and so forth. And one of the questions that comes up is, particularly with the Second and First Amendments, is that fundamental rights typically have a justification clause and an operations clause, and there are different ways of interpreting whether you have to exercise some of the opportunities in the justification clause in order to justify your claim to have a natural right to something. For example, with the Second Amendment, Eugene Volokh recently did a video for PragerU in which he explained how this works. One of the justification clause was of course a well-ordered militia, and so that would imply that to claim the right, you have to belong to some sort of group that is involved in self-defense. Now, that's not very practical today like it was in the 18th century. And it's also true that the Heller decision in the District of Columbia struck down that idea by 5-4. It said that you only needed to uphold the operational right to make your claim of a fundamental right. However, the idea is still interesting. If in fact, to own a weapon for self-defense, you had to pass if you have to pass a background check, and you have to pass, if you're not allowed to have military-style weapons, and you have to close the loopholes, some of these reasonable things, which, by the way, the Supreme Court has said you can have reasonable rules. I think it did say that. But if in addition, maybe you have to have certification, maybe you have to be registered with the government, maybe you have to have some training, maybe you even have to earn some proficiency, maybe you have to actually show a need in your living circumstances for a weapon. Maybe it's better if you're in a rural environment. Maybe preferably you have to have dependents who depend on you to protect them. Maybe that leads to ideas like if you're a teacher, maybe you need to have some competence in defending students if you're ever confronted with a situation. Maybe you should have had some prior military service. Maybe you should be a member of a volunteer fire department or something like that. You could have strings attached to this idea of exercising your right. One idea would be biosensors, making sure that a gun can only be fired by the person that actually bought it and it was intended for, which gets back to the private sale rule, which I think was a controversy in Virginia. But that's what all of this could mean. Now, in Australia, back after an incident in 1996, they did a huge confiscation and they put a lot of the rules like this into place. I don't know exactly what they were. PragerU has another video on that. That's not very practical in the United States where there are 300 million weapons. But if you want to have reasonable rules, or if you want to have stricter rules like March of Our Lives may want to have, if you want to have a peace treaty or something, you probably would need to have legal justification for requiring that the justification for the right that the holder of the right exercise some of the opportunities that justification offers before he can claim the right. Now, the Supreme Court said that's not true, and we'll talk in another video in just a minute about how this applies in the First Amendment. But so that's where we are. I'm sympathetic I was in Richmond on MLK Day, and I'm sympathetic to the problem we have. No matter what you do, someone takes more risk than other people take. And it's sort of a skin in the game problem. The public is at risk in schools, it's at shopping malls, theaters, and so forth on the one hand. On the other hand, the public is at risk from if people don't know how to defend themselves from external enemies. That's true. And people who live in rural areas, if they're not allowed to have self-defense that they claim they need, those people wind up bearing more of the personal risk. So there's a skin of the game problem that Nicholas Taleb has talked about. That's I think, very important. So that would be the other major consideration, is how you deploy risk and how you expect people to share risk and living together in a society. And the Second Amendment certainly has something to do with that. When people can take care of themselves when they have to, and maybe in a more isolated environment, in some ways society is safer, but in other ways some components of society may be less safe just because of practical realities. There is no way to not have people exposed to some risk, and I think we need to bear that in mind.